The Spin-off Podcast Network. Skinny are helping you show how smart you are with the 1Q quiz, an all-new, super challenging and super quick daily quiz built by the Spin-off. Every Monday, Skinny are giving you the chance to prove you're smart with the Skinny Extra Credit question. Get it right, and you'll get the chance to score yourself some Skinny Extra mobile credit, so you can text, call, or even video call your group chat and gloat about how big your brain is. T's and C's apply.
When the Facts Change is brought to you by the Spin-off Podcast Network in partnership with Kiwibank, the bank for Kiwi looking to get ahead in business and in life. A bank that delivers expertise and banking know-how, smart advice for business owners wanting to invest, grow their business or diversify. A bank that adapts with technology through the lens of its people and customers. It is a bank with heart that is driven by its purpose. Kiwi, making Kiwi better off. The cost of living. There's no hotter topic right now. Politically, socially, economically. So what is it and how has it changed? Turns out it's different for everyone. And that old economist's catchphrase, "it depends," matters. However, in Aotearoa, New Zealand, we have different ways of measuring the costs of living. And the bluntest tools we have to run the economy for monetary policy depend on one particular measure. But it may not be the best measure of the cost of living. This week on When the Facts Change, we talk with Sabrina Delgado, who is an economist at Kiwibank and has taken a really close look at the HLPI. You haven't heard of the HLPI? Well, you should, because it's the Household Living Price Index, a way of looking at the costs of living, which isn't the Consumer Price Index, the way that most of us think about inflation. And right now, the numbers are quite different. The CPI inflation rate, as at the end of December, was just 4.7%. Now that's higher than the 1 to 3% band that the Reserve Bank would like it to be, but it actually was quite different to the overall measure for the HLPI, the Household Living Price Index, which is broken down for different types of consumers, income earners. So you go from the 5 different quintiles of income earners, the 5 different quintiles of spenders, beneficiaries, superannuitants, and works out what their costs are. Because, of course, everyone's different. And typically, if, for your example, you're on the lower part of the income spectrum or the lower part of the spending spectrum, or you're a beneficiary, you spend a lot more of your money on food, on rent, on transport, than, for example, if you're on the highest income groups. And of course, over the years, the prices of those different types of costs of living have changed in different ways. So right now, those people who have a mortgage, who may have a home, are really seeing their cost of living rise quickly because, of course, of higher mortgages. And we go into quite a bit of depth on this with Sabrina. However, over many years, the cost of living for some particular groups has been higher than the CPI. For example, if you are a smoker, you tend to have higher living costs than others from tobacco because the taxes have been increasing much faster. And not only does it matter which measure of inflation we have, because that gives us some idea of what's happening to the cost of living, but there are some feedback loops in there as well, given the government now changes people's main benefits based off CPI inflation, not the household living price indices, or wage inflation, which typically has been higher than CPI inflation. And that's the indexation used for superannuitants. So the costs of living is more than one thing, and it matters. There are feedback loops. And we go into one particular feedback loop, whether or not you include interest costs in this consumer price index, and we don't, and how that affects the way the Reserve Bank runs monetary policy. This week, we go deep on the costs of living with Sabrina Delgado from Kiwibank. Well, kia ora, and welcome to Sabrina Delgado, an economist at Kiwibank. Welcome in to When the Facts Change.
Kia ora, thank you for having me.
I'm curious about one of those core drivers in our lives, in our economy, in our politics, and certainly in our monetary policy, inflation. Sabrina, what is inflation, and what is the measure you think most people think inflation is?
Yeah, it's a big question for a big topic. So when we're talking about inflation, we're talking about the general price increase in a representative basket of goods and services. I think most of the time when people think of inflation, they're thinking of that number that comes out once a quarter. It's all over the news headlines, and that's based off a measure called the CPI. It's a really interesting measure. It's what the Reserve Bank most favors to look at inflation, but it's actually not the only measure out there.
Yeah, because when I think of inflation, you're right, I think of CPI, Consumer Price Index inflation. And if you think of an economy and the key measures as a dashboard, if you've got a couple of dials, one of them's going to be inflation and the other one's probably going to be GDP. So CPI is the one that the Reserve Bank looks at, that you're right, is on the headline news. But actually, there is another measure which you could argue is more relevant for some people. Tell us about it.
Yeah, so there is another measure developed by Stats NZ. It's called the Household Living Cost Price Index. Like I said, it is a measure of inflation, but there's a few differences. So let's go back to the CPI first. The CPI, it measures inflation across and price increases across a basket of representative goods and services for the economy. So there's two problems that we have with the CPI. The first is that it's quarterly data, and unlike the rest of the world, we're not getting it on a monthly basis. But the other thing is that it only gives us an aggregate measure of the whole economy. We don't get to see deeper insights. So I always like to use an analogy of going to the supermarket, right? If me and you were at the supermarket, we're not buying the same goods and services, right? We have different things in our basket, different quantities, and the cost that we get at the end is different. It's the same with inflation, and that's just not picked up by the CPI.
And what if I was fasting? Went into the supermarket.
Exactly. Yeah, there are people out there like that. And so...
Or maybe I'm earning so much that I don't actually care what the prices are in the supermarket, because the amount I spend on food, particularly after my fasting, means that it's not such a big deal. Whereas someone with the trolley in front of me may actually be spending 40% of their disposable income in that shop. So it's quite different how inflation affects people, and this measure gives us a sense of how different. What are the different strands of the HLPI you can look at?
Yeah, so the HLPI instead looks into, it breaks down inflation into 13 different groups. Still not a perfect measure. 13 in a country as diverse as New Zealand. There's a lot more you could go into, but the HLPI gives us a look into 5 income groups, 5 expenditure groups, Māori, superannuants, and beneficiaries.
And so you'd think that inflation is a broad idea, that it affects everyone the same. But of course, when you look a bit deeper, you can see that for a long period, for example, the price of cigarettes and alcohol, particularly cigarettes, rose much faster than other prices because taxes were being increased. Also, there have been times when rents have been rising faster or slower than other times, or the price of avocados might have gone berserk because there was an avocado shortage. So can you give us a sense of how the inflation trends have differed for those different groups in recent years?
Yeah, definitely. So it's quite interesting. When I set out to look at this data and sort of write a story on it, I was kind of going into it thinking and expecting to see those in sort of the lower income, lower expenditure groups to actually be facing the highest inflation. And I was actually quite stunned to see that isn't actually what's happening. I mean, up until 2021, that was what we were seeing. But in this most recent big bout of generalized inflation that we've had, it's actually been those in the highest expenditure groups that have faced the highest inflation. And it comes down to one big difference in the Household Living Cost Price Index, and that's it includes interest repayments.
Wow. So the CPI doesn't include changes in mortgage rates?
No, it doesn't. So the CPI it includes sort of the cost of new dwellings and rents, but because the CPI is used more for the purpose of monetary policy, it actually excludes interest repayments to avoid circularity in the measure.
Because if the Reserve Bank put up mortgage rates, that would put up an element of the CPI, and the Reserve Bank's supposed to keep the CPI down. So in a way, it would be powering a feedback loop against itself.
Yeah, you're spot on.
And so that sounds like a major difference, and that means those people with big mortgages would have seen their living costs increase dramatically over the last couple of years, because that increase in mortgage rates is one of the fastest we've seen, certainly in the last 20 years or so. And because it seems to have stayed here for a bit longer, it seems more painful for some. Let's just drill down a bit more into the different types of people measured in the HLPI, in particular superannuitants versus beneficiaries versus those people on the lowest incomes. How do they differ?
Yeah, so it's interesting. For superannuants, they've actually seen, over this inflationary period, they've faced the lowest inflation. And it comes down to the fact that, you expect a lot of people who've retired, they've mostly paid off their mortgages. They're not actually being affected by these higher interest rates. And it's a bit of a similar story for those in the lower income groups and also for Māori. What we're seeing is instead of interest repayments being the largest contributor, it's actually coming down to housing in the form of rents and also food prices that are having more of an effect.
And so that plays out in different ways depending on who you are. I'm curious too about whether this matters from a policy point of view, because we know the Reserve Bank has a target range, and it's quite a fudgy thing actually, in that it says they're aiming to keep inflation between 1% to 3% over the medium term. So there's some wiggle room there for them. But they're looking at CPI inflation, not household living price indices, to the point now where CPI inflation, the last measure we have, was 4.7%, and HLPI, the broad measure of that, was 7%. So that's a big difference. But the Reserve Bank still has to look at the CPI. What are the prospects then for those two numbers, the 4.7% for the CPI and the 7% for the HLPI, and whether or not we're going to get some mortgage rate relief?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I mean, like you said, at the end of the day, the Reserve Bank is going to focus on that CPI number. It is an aggregate measure, and there are limitations to that. But we kind of talk a lot about how monetary policy in itself is quite a blunt tool. Even just they have one measure, right? They can either lift the OCR or lower it, and that damage, they can't really mitigate how that damage is done. And I think that's why looking at this household living cost price index, it actually gives you a bit of an insight into where this damage is being felt the most. And it's interesting, this time around that we have seen inflation being felt the hardest by those in the highest expenditure quintile. It's kind of good news. It's probably where the Reserve Bank wants to target inflation, They actually want to see those that are spending the most actually feeling the pinch the most so that they can cut back on their spending. And that will feed through more greatly onto inflation as well. So I think, to answer your question, you probably can't have one without the other. There's a reason the HLPI exists, and I think it's got its place.
When the Facts Change is brought to you in partnership with Kiwibank to help you understand the issues affecting the economy. And that's what their team of experts is here to do too. Here's Kiwibank economist Sabrina Delgado on what's happening with the labour market in Aotearoa.
Our slowing economy gives way to higher unemployment, and we're seeing tightness in the labour market quickly abating. Both a recovery on the supply side, with our surging migration boosting labour supply and loosening some very tight labour market conditions. But now a stronger narrative is coming through. As consumer demand cools, so too is the demand for labour. Firms are no longer hiring with the same gusto. Already, unemployment has started to lift from record lows, and we expect that to continue throughout 2024.
Visit kiwibank.co.nz to stay up to date with detailed economic analysis and forecasts from Sabrina and other Kiwibank experts. They take big issues from both here and overseas and make them relevant to Kiwi businesses.
Ready to rediscover the joys of cycling? With over 300 kilometres of cycle paths across Tāmaki Makaurau, jumping on your bike and going for a ride is such a fun way to discover the city from a different perspective. Cycling is getting more and more popular across Auckland, so now's a great time to join the hype and give cycling a go. Head to at.govt/cycling to find your nearest cycleway today.
And that mechanism for monetary policy to work, I mean, you're suggesting it there that if the Reserve Bank puts up the official cash rate, that can flow through almost immediately into floating mortgage rates. But for a lot of borrowers, they're on fixed rates.
Yes.
And the relationship isn't quite as direct or as fast. Can you talk us a bit through there how that monetary policy impulse maybe is blunted? The blunt tool gets blunted even more because of the fixed rate issue.
Yeah, so we always say that monetary policy works with quite sufficient lags. So as you've mentioned, those on fixed mortgage rates, they could be fixed for 1 or 2 years. It takes time for them to roll off, and we've seen it in the most recent OCR hiking cycle. We had people who were on 2% inflation. They may be fixed for 2% interest rates. They probably fixed for 1 to 2 years, and then all of a sudden they were at 5%. It's a big shift. It's not a gradual easing from 2 to 5. And then again, you have them rolling off onto these 7% interest rates, and that does make a difference.
And that delayed reaction means that for a lot of people, it's really only now that they're seeing the huge impact in their disposable income. Even though the Reserve Bank started putting up the official cash rate at the end of 2021, it was pretty much the first of the world's central banks to do it. And it's increased the official cash rate from pretty much 0 to 5.5%. That has flowed through. But there is another factor here that I'm curious about. The banks charge their fixed mortgage rates based on their total funding costs, and that includes some of the longer-term interest rates, which are affected by what happens on international markets. How much of a further blunting of the tool comes from what's happening on international interest rate markets?
Yeah, you're right. International markets do play a role. We were actually talking about it in a call today about, we're talking about the Fed, right? They're sort of the central bank to watch right now. And a lot of bets are that they'll cut in June, which will actually see these sort of wholesale longer-term interest rates start to fall and give a bit of relief. But if they don't, does that mean that the OCR here in New Zealand needs to start cutting sooner to have some more relief?
So one of the other reasons it's worth watching the CPI and the HLPI is the feedback loops for incomes. Can you talk a bit more about that?
Yeah, so typically when we're in a high inflationary environment, we as workers, we sort of think, okay, the price of things are going up. I need my wage to be higher. So we tend to look to our wages and sort of expect them to be higher with a higher inflationary environment. And as you said, it's a feedback loop because when we demand these higher wages, of course, those paying our wages, they have to take that into account. And they will probably push through this higher expense to them onto their goods and services. And it does turn into this feedback loop. So it is a really important thing to look at.
And just finally, Sabrina, is there relief on the horizon?
Yeah, I'm happy to say that we think so. Inflation is coming down, whether you look at it on the CPI or the HLPI. And if we're looking at the HLPI, the one that takes into account these interest repayments, we think the OCR, we think the Reserve Bank will be in a position to actually start cutting the OCR in November this year. And that's going to feed through onto these interest rate repayments. and should relieve some of the financial burden that these groups are feeling right now.
Sabrina Delgado, an economist for Kiwibank, thank you very much for being on When the Facts Change.
Thank you.
When the Facts Change was brought to you by the Spin-Off Podcast Network, together with Kiwibank. Visit kiwibank.co.nz to find out how Kiwibank are making Kiwi better off.
Talofa lava. I'm Madeline Chapman, editor at The Spin-Off. If you have the means, consider supporting our high-quality journalism by becoming a Spin-Off member. Sign up now at thespinoff.co.nz/donate.
The Spin-Off Podcast Network.